Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special event with King County Library System. I'm Chase Gallagher. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing here at KCLS, where we serve more than 1.3 million residents with our 50 locations across King County. We are so excited to have Ali Vitali here tonight in conversation with Heidi Daniel, Executive Director of King County Library System. Ali is the author of Electable, Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet, and a current Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC News in Washington, D.C. Ali's book takes us through not just the last few presidential election cycles, where we saw more women candidates than ever before, but explores what's led to this point in American political history, and with just the second woman major political party nominee in Vice President Harris running this year. I know tonight's conversation will prompt a lot of questions from you in the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar to submit your question. And then at the end, we will get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Before I get started, I want to mention a few other events coming up to put on your radar. First, on Saturday, we have Sharon Hashimoto for an event in Tukwila, reading from her new collection of short stories, Stealing Home. On October 7th, we have Pushcart Prize-winning fiction writer and essayist Marcela Fuentes, author of Mallas, which was just selected for the Good Morning America Book Club. That's a free online event. And keeping on theme with tonight's event, tomorrow we have an online event, Your Voice, Your Choice, a guide to voting for judges with an amazing panel. You can get information about any of these events and all of the events throughout KCLS at kcls.org. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi and Ali.
Great. Thanks, Chase. Hi, Ali. How are you this evening?
Very excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me. And thanks to Chase, who I met at a Governor Jay Inslee event like 5 years ago now, and who is still one of my favorite people out there in Seattle. So you guys are so lucky to have him.
That's great. We feel very lucky to have Chase as well. And we feel very lucky to have you here with us this evening. I'm really excited to talk about Electable, your book. You have covered the 2016 campaign. You covered the Trump White House years. You covered the 2020 campaign, which of course was upended by the pandemic. And you covered the 2022 midterms. The Electable, the book, starts us, the reader, out at the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. So there has been so much change and turmoil, even within the last 3 months. Tell us, what is going on out there?
Ooh, I mean, I always like to start conversations like this with a really deep breath, especially because so much has happened and it's moving so fast. I mean, I often joke with people. I started covering the first Trump campaign. I was at a Trump rally just last week. And if someone said to me, oh, it's actually September 2016, instead of September 2024, I'd be like, yeah, you're probably right. Because everything just sort of feels like it's been on this long continuum. I think obviously the biggest change, though, that we're looking at right now is why this book looks even more relevant than it was when I wrote it, which is because Kamala Harris now sits at the top of the ticket and has basically a 50-50 shot of breaking that final and tallest glass ceiling in becoming America's first woman president, in becoming the first woman of color president, all of these different barriers to be broken. And of course, the way that she got here is a way that if they wrote it in a fiction show, we would say Shonda Rhimes had lost her mind because it jumped so many sharks, but here we are. And I think that sort of crazy non-traditional way of getting her here is why she's here in the first place. Because generally, when you look at the ways that women candidates and people of color are hurt in the process of running for office, primaries are the period of time in a campaign where resources, money, staff, it's all harder for candidates that are non-white and non-male. For Vice President Harris, this time around, she didn't have to go through any of that. And there's certainly some criticism that can be leveled about that. But just because of the way it happened, it took out some of the most damaging parts where the isms, sexism, racism, genderism are the most prevalent for candidates. And it's why she's sitting here today atop a bed of joy, as many voters and pundits like to talk about, as opposed to coming in bruised from a primary battle that could have been quite damaging.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because in your book, you talk about the fact that a lot of candidates who are women or candidates of color are coming from behind because they're not part of the established political machine, right? They don't have all of the resources of an established candidate. And then you also talk about how President Biden made this sort of really intentional choice when he chose Vice President Harris, and also about how he had talked about himself even in 2020 and even before that with President Obama. He really positioned himself as this bridge president. So tell me a little bit about President Biden's history and his sort of bridge president theme that he had, or the way he talked about that, and his choice around choosing very intentionally this woman, this BIPOC woman, to be his running mate as vice president.
A bridge, however, reluctantly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all went through those, 2 or 3 weeks in July, where Biden was ultimately forced out of this reelection bid. But look, he has this quote that he said around the time of the inauguration in 2021, where he said, 8 years ago, I was standing at this train station in Wilmington, a white man going to meet a black man who was about to become an historic president. And now here I am 8 years later. I am about to go to yet another inauguration where I am going to meet a black woman who is about to make history by being the first vice president who has that kind of identity. Biden himself, and I talked to Obama advisors about this, was in 2008 someone who was able to not grapple with the thorny issues of race, of policing in the same way that Obama did, while also being, of course, a savvy veteran Washington operator, a graybeard on foreign policy who could both assuage the physical newness of Obama, the way that advisors thought about it, and then also the newness politically in Washington, especially relative to the way that these institutions often function. Harris was able to do the reverse for Biden, right? Bringing in a breath of fresh air, a former rival. That's why she was chosen. The entire Veep stakes, and we get into this in the book, this idea that Harris was almost dinged or attacked for being too ambitious, having run for president herself, as if Biden wasn't ambitious when he was chosen for vice president, as if Pence wasn't ambitious when he was, all of these things. But ultimately, Biden dropping out of the race, and in the same breath, minutes later, different statement, but minutes later, endorsing his vice president, and then watching the coalescing in Washington. I mean, as someone who covered her 2020 race, as someone who covered her vice presidency, I was surprised to see so many people who publicly and privately were very skeptical of her abilities, of her political savvy, and watching them all come out publicly to emphatically say that she was the next nominee. To me, it was a sign of how far she had come politically, of how the issue set specifically around abortion had really moved into her political sweet spot. But then also the way that the party itself was just so exhausted that the idea of any kind of mini primary, however many it was going to be, just really didn't sit well with people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. That rings very true. And I think even though Vice President candidate Harris is coming out on this sort of wave of joy or the spout of joy, it's still a lot of challenges that you just touched on there, even around her being too ambitious or the way we talk about women candidates. In your book, you talk about one instance, and it ties into a recent tweet you had as well. You talk about the sequin gate or the sparkly jacket.
Yes.
And I actually was listening to the audiobook, and I was walking, and I stopped, and I knew exactly I could picture it. I knew exactly what jacket it was. I remembered when this happened, and I remembered at the time thinking exactly what you said. But male candidates, we cover them on the golf course. We cover them skeet shooting. We cover them, in these boardrooms. We cover them doing these male things that just seem very normal for a president or a candidate to do. And then all of a sudden you have this female candidate shopping with small businesses, which would be maybe a normal thing to do. But because of the gender biases and stereotypes that exist, the way it was talked about was so completely different. And then recently during the debate, you tweeted about a pollster who mentioned that her face, if she stayed, or you said, the poster was talking about her facial expressions, and you tweeted, if she stayed serious, the complaint might be that she's too stern or robotic. If she has reactions or laugh, she's unserious or mocking. And I think that that's something that all of us as females in our career, who are leaders, really relate to, that inability to win. You're either too stern, too ambitious, you don't take things seriously enough. I mean, the little known obscure poet Taylor Swift certainly has written some songs about this. And I just want to talk about that a little bit and really delve into those double standards and how they still exist today, and how you think that's going to impact her Kamala Harris's bid for presidency, and how that's going to like play out.
Yeah, that same obscure poet once wrote, "If I were the man, I'd be the man." And the number of times a day that I think about that, because I do think that for many of us, it's relatable, right? I'm not running for president. You're not running for president, but we are existing in spaces where we are asked to lead. And there is still oftentimes a pushback to female leadership. And so I think in writing this book, for me personally, as someone who had not just a front row seat to women vying for power, but who myself is in my own ecosystem of corporate America at a large news outlet, I often felt some of the same frustrations and manifestations of what it is to be female, to be powerful, and to find that that's sometimes a double-edged sword. I'll take those of you who are on this Zoom who weren't chronically online or just living the 2019 early days of the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. Let me just take you back really briefly to one of my favorite stories in the book. I'm out covering Kamala Harris. It is like February or March of 2019, and we're in Columbia, South Carolina. We are on a street called Lady Street, which couldn't be more perfect if Aaron Sorkin tried to write it that way. And we're in a small business with a woman who stays in my mind regularly, because the woman who owned the business had pulled herself out of poverty. She was homeless. She got into college. She was able to leverage the different systems that her state offered her to put herself through college. And then she started a thrift store so that she could have a way to give back to her community. There was a part of the store that also had a tie to her college, where she was able to help people who might be struggling with homelessness, with money problems. All of that was so essential to me, and it was part of community building and experience. And that's why Kamala Harris, then a senator, went there. The mistake that she made, and I say mistake because for anyone else who wasn't a woman, this wouldn't have been a big deal, and it probably wouldn't have been a great moment. She tried on a sparkly jacket because me and the several other women who happened to be in her press corps that day really pushed her to try on this sparkly jacket. She tries it on. She's laughing in the mirror. It's way too big on her. We are cackling. It is a moment of levity and joy. And I know that presidential campaigns are serious business, but we often need the levity and joy because it's a way for us to get to know these candidates, to showcase that to y'all who are not out there on the campaign trail with us. And so she tries on the jacket. We are tweeting about it. I went to school in New Orleans. I call it the Mardi Gras jacket. This thing starts going viral. And it starts going viral because some very tightly wound white men on Twitter, conservative Twitter to be specific, were very upset that little girls were following unserious female presidential candidates on the campaign trail. And to me, it was a reminder of the way that the rest of the cycle would go for women. And I was covering predominantly women through the cycle. They could do the most normal thing by doing a campaign event that was focused on the community, on policy, on giving back, and it would still be reduced to something risky because it would show them to be unserious. Never mind that Mitt Romney and Barack Obama had gone shopping, literally shopping, and no one thought any negative thing about it. But it's a reminder that it's just different when you're different. And it was also a reminder for me to be ready to push back on those narratives that were candidly just deeply unfair.
Yeah. Definitely. And I just thought that story just really highlighted that deep unfairness we often see in both parties. There are female campaigns, like just the narrative around those candidates. In 2016, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but especially as we're trying to metabolize people now, right?
Right.
The thing I hear from voters is I want to get to know the candidates better. I want to know more about Kamala Harris. To know someone doesn't just mean to know their policies, though it definitely means that. It also means, what is it about them that's more than that? What's the vibe? Is it joy? Is it seriousness? Whatever. Showing authenticity for women candidates is demanded. We saw that with Hillary Clinton, but it's also riskier.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting because with strong male leaders, you do have this sort of conversation around the cult of personality, right? The idea that they have this larger than life personality that can attract followers just because of their charisma. But then with women, the narrative is often different. You have to have enough charisma, but not too much charisma.
Yep.
And you have to be authentic, but at the same time serious. And it's frustrating to hear those narratives continue to play out when it seems like we've moved so far beyond that, but yet we haven't. So even as voters are now seeing more and more women on the ballot and thinking about them as really viable political candidates, as you point out in your book, there's still these double standards. And I wonder if they will go away over time, especially as these higher profile candidacies like this year take place, or if we will just start to think about that narrative differently.
Normalizing people running for office who don't just look like everyone that came before them is the key to this. The problem is presidential elections only happen every 4 years. I say only because I'm a complete political junkie. I would love to cover all the presidents, but for voters, I get it. Every 4 years might just be enough. But it means that you're looking at the smallest of the smallest subset. And that's a really critical piece to this, because you have to fill the pipeline with viable candidates in order to get to a point where women are running in every single future presidential primary. And I do think that 2020 was the beginning of a really positive trend, or the end of a really abysmal one, which is, I think it's the last primary we will see where women aren't running, which is to say you're always going to see women candidates running in the primary, at least one of them. And look, we saw that 2020, more women running in the Democratic primary than ever before. 2024, Nikki Haley, the only woman, but still a woman in the field, the longest one standing there next to Trump as an alternative. Essential. It means that the pipeline has finally caught up. It means that there are enough women who are now continuing to serve in the House, continuing to serve in the Senate, running for governor's mansions. All of that is essential to make sure that women are running. Their resumes are built for that. Their resources are built for that. All of this is critically important as we look at the infrastructure to make sure, what Kamala Harris quotes from her mother all the time, to make sure that if you're the first, that you're not the last.
Yeah, I love that quote just in general. I think it's a great indication of how we need to lead as women. And again, across both parties, make sure if you're the first, you're not the last, right? That we're helping pull each other up. In 2016, thinking back to Hillary Clinton being the first woman as a major political party candidate for president, a lot was made about her being the first. There was a lot of talk about that. With this election, it doesn't seem to be as prominent, even though there are a lot of firsts for Vice President Harris, right? So why do you think it's not as big of a centerpiece, and is that good or bad?
It's on purpose. That's the one thing that's for sure. We didn't see her wearing white at the Democratic National Convention. Of course, Hillary famously did that. You know, all of these different hallmarks that speak both subtly and quite directly and blatantly to the firstness, to the history, are gone with Harris. And I think that a large piece of that is not trying to make it about her identity, just making it about the fact that she's here, she's good enough to be here, she deserves to be here, earned her spot here. That is clearly the focus. With Clinton, and it's so fascinating to look at the differences between her 2008 run and her 2016 run, and I dip back into these in the book, having talked to Clinton advisors about it. In 2008, they almost did the exact opposite as they did in 2016. They were trying to run as if she was the biggest man in a field of men in 2008, almost pretending there was no difference. In 2016, it was an overcorrection, right? Society was like girl bossing all over the place. I mean, it was cool to finally be a feminist. Hillary Clinton certainly trying to ride that wave as well. And then, of course, you come to Kamala Harris, and I think part of it is the normalization of it, right? She is not the first woman to be a major party nominee.
Right.
She is the second. Um, the untraditional way, as we talked about, of how she got this job, trying to blunt innately any attacks that are already are coming from Republicans, that somehow she is a diversity hire. I mean, the good news is that those remarks were pushed back upon in Congress pretty quickly. Even the Speaker of the
Yeah.
House apparently said to his colleague when those remarks were made, I don't think that's the most constructive way for us to be talking about this election.
Yeah.
But I do think that that is a clear rhetorical and strategic choice from the Harris campaign to just do the thing and not speak to the other thing. And that seems pretty clear from them.
Let me ask about women in the GOP. So in the Republican Party, there are some notable women kind of keeping the Trump presidency or standing up against the Trump presidency and the Trump campaign. You've got Liz Cheney, obviously to some degree, Nikki Haley, who ran against President Trump, senator from California who lost her seat and is now a statewide candidate. Tell me, how are the women in the Republican Party, how are they pushing back or shaping what the Republican Party will be?
Look, the majority of them are the opposite of the kind of person that you're describing, but there is, I think, a really interesting thread that I have been noticing over the course of the last several years, that women, whether they are overtly Republicans or just women in the political space, are the ones sort of leading the accountability charge against former President Trump. I mean, legally speaking, you look at someone like E. Jean Carroll bringing that civil case. Obviously, eventually he is found criminally liable for sexual abuse. That is now a point in the history books. Then, of course, you look congressionally, people like Congresswoman Liz Cheney leading the charge on the January 6th committee. The fact that Officer Caroline Edwards, one of the Capitol Police officers who was assaulted that day on January 6th, was one of the key witnesses to testify. That's then nothing to say of Cassidy Hutchinson, who herself faced many threats, having worked in the Trump administration, then turning around and doing one of the most, I would argue, critical hearings for the January 6th committee, detailing what happened inside the White House that day. And then, of course, Nikki Haley being the person who was the last standing Trump alternative. And I covered her campaign as well. And she was certainly not as anti-Trump. I mean, she regularly said this to the frustration of some voters, but she was willing to call out various ways that he fell short, in her words, morally on the world stage, in ways that she, thought he was too old or they needed a new generational candidate. I mean, women at each point have been the counterpoint to Trump. And I do think it's really been a fascinating thread to watch. I mean, gender is so central to Trump and to Trumpism. Whereas you watch the DNC and maybe everyone else was talking about Kamala Harris's historic potential, except for Kamala Harris. But if you watched the RNC, gender was so central there. It was all about macho. It was all about hypermasculinity. And Trump has always centered those things. It's part of his appeal. I mean, the idea of being a wannabe strongman is something he's been criticized for, but certainly it is a posture that he wears on stage at these rallies, having gone to hundreds of them over the course of my career covering the former president. Gender is a central selling point for him. And so anyone who thinks, gender is only for Democrats because their nominee is a woman is not remembering the fact that gender is both things, and that it's so central to Trump's appeal.
Yeah. Switching back a little bit to the historical nature of this presidency, and just in general, you delve into the sort of history of gender and politics in your book in a really fascinating way. And you had the opportunity to talk to several leaders in that field. You talked to Senator Hillary Clinton in the book. You talked to Shirley Chisholm in the book. You get to talk to several historical figures. You talked to Elizabeth Warren several times. There's conversations that you've you lay out with her, and Kamala Harris is obviously a central figure in this book,
Yeah.
but you do not talk to her campaign. They declined to talk to you for the book. So do you want to tell us a little bit about why that is, or how that impacted your writing of the book?
Well, I definitely talked to people in her orbit, definitely talked to people
Yeah.
who worked on her campaign, who worked in the vice presidential office, but not the vice president herself. They said it didn't align with their schedule. You know, I was disappointed. I think it would have been extremely illuminating for people to hear from the first female vice president, the person who is closer to the Oval Office than any woman has ever gotten before. That being said, there were a lot of people who still spoke with me for this book, both about her and then about their own experiences. I mean, I talked with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I talked with Senator Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, the other women who ran in 2020. But not only that, I was able to talk with Carly Fiorina, who ran in 2016. And then I was able to go back through C-SPAN and other really amazing archival footage and written accounts from Elizabeth Dole's campaign in 2000, from Carol Moseley Braun's campaign in 2004, and then going all the way back to Shirley Chisholm, who's the first Black woman to ever run in the 1970s. And you look at this moment, and I think I've been thinking a lot about Chisholm specifically over the course of the last few months. She has this portrait in the halls of the Capitol, and it is beautiful and fierce and vibrant, and really inspirational. It's one of my favorite to walk by, but every time I do, I think about the work that Chisholm did, not just by running. And when she announced, she did so in a room of predominantly men who laughed when she announced her long shot bid for president. She lost, obviously, of course, but she was also a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And the role of that institution to this day is to figure out ways to get more Black lawmakers into the halls of Congress and give them a seat at the table, to make policy, craft policy, and rise through the halls of power to continue to have a seat at that table. Famously, Chisholm would say, if they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair.
Right.
But her work is so central to the line that you can draw from the 1970s all the way through Kamala Harris here in the vice presidency, regardless of what happens in November. And those are the building blocks, right? Each of those women who ran, regardless of what party they ran for, was putting a block in the road so that it was one less piece of unpaved pavement for these women to have to go on after them. And that is amazing and beautiful. And it is also exhausting to imagine that every move that you make is going to be tied to whoever comes after you, because you will inevitably be compared to them, or you will be tied with their baggage or whatever. I mean, I remember in 2020, the number of people who said, oh, well, Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton are basically the same. You know, they kind of look alike and they're both a little bit exact. It's like, have you met these women politically? They're completely different people. But nevertheless, I mean, that is the blessing and the curse of creating something new and being a trailblazer.
Absolutely. And I do recognize I said Senator Clinton. I meant Secretary Clinton.
She was once a senator. You were not wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I was like, I'm thinking through all of the people you talked about in your book, which are so many amazing women across the spectrum. And I always have loved that quote by Shirley Chisholm about, if they don't give you a seat, bring a folding chair. And I also had an opportunity in my previous career in Baltimore to work with Senator Barbara Mikulski, who is one of the sort of original group of women trailblazing, and was one of the longest running female senators. And she used to talk about male allies being just as important to her, like the men who would promote and uplift the women who were in these political offices, because we certainly can help each other out. We can think about those coming behind us. We can bring our own chairs. But the role of those in power to promote people who don't look like them into those roles is really important. Do you have any thoughts about the role that plays now and in the future?
It goes back to what we were saying about President Biden, right?
Yeah.
He picked Vice President Harris, then Senator Harris, for the job because she was more than qualified to do it. She was qualified to be vice president, having served in the Senate, having been attorney general atop the biggest Department of Justice at the statewide level next to the federal Department of Justice. She often used to love to say that on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
Having served through levels of government. she is completely qualified, and also was put there by someone who looks like everyone, with the exception of Barack Obama, who came before. So that's critically important. I mean, Senator Mikulski is a favorite of mine. She was always a colorful quote, especially as I was going back through. And I remember in 1996, the year of the woman, the year that you get people like Senator Patty Murray running and ushering themselves into the halls of Congress. I mean, that year of the woman, it was like 4 women got elected, and it was like, oh my God, it's a pink wave. I mean, 2018 it looks massive. It's a tsunami in comparison to 1996.
Absolutely.
But Mikulski, I remember, was asked about this idea of the year of the woman, and she sort of scoffed it off by saying, like, what's next? You're going to be calling it like the year of the caribou. Like, no, it's just women being elected to the space. I mean, even then she was trying to normalize in the way that you're now seeing the Harris campaign not even speak to it, because they just want it to be, it's not even part of the conversation. We're here because we've earned it and we're qualified to be here, and let's just go run this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that normalizing, and I think it's fantastic. Let's hope that we see more women across the spectrum running for these offices. So before we get to the audience question, my final question for you is, what if you had to go back and talk to yourself before you wrote this book? What would you be telling yourself prior to writing it?
Oh, so many things. What would I be telling myself? You know, I think I love the book that I put out because it did the thing that I was so eager to do, which is bring people inside, not just what it's like for the women who are running. And I'm so grateful that so many of them, and aides to them, and people who know them, and just really great sources of mine, were willing to give their time and energy to detailing what this looked like and give their brilliant ideas and takes on what this 2020 campaign was like and where its connection points were in history. I'm so grateful for all of that. But the other thing that was really important to me was giving people an idea of what it is to be a woman on the campaign trail. You know, one of my favorite chapters in the book is the day that Elizabeth Warren drops out, because it was a day of complete frenzy. I think I did 15 separate live shots on television from 7 o'clock in the morning until like 9 o'clock at night. I mean, these days are so long, but the thing that I hope that readers continue to come away with from this book is just the deep passion that I have, that other people who are out there on the road have. And at a time when I think credibility in journalism is so important, that is one of the things and connection points that I really hope to build. And so, you know, if I could go back and tell myself, I'm not one for regrets, but if I could go back and tell myself something before I wrote the book, I would say, like, that's the right path. Like, lean on that, be authentic to yourself, even though it's sometimes a double-edged sword for women. So I wrote this book truly with like all of the passion that I bring to political reporting. It is truly my favorite thing.
Yeah, it was a really fabulous book. And I have to say, I found the parts where you talk about being on the campaign trails and a woman covering these to be really interesting. And you drink an impressive amount of oat and almond milk lattes. So
no, and you know what, maybe that would be the advice, is like drink less, or maybe admit to it less, because I have been on many a book stop where people are like, are you okay? And I'm like, I'm fine.
So thank you so much for sharing your experiences and doing this analysis. I think going into the next year, if you haven't read this book, please check it out. We have it at the library, buy it from the local bookstores. We really have a lot to learn from this book, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the next few months and the years to come. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the audience questions that they have for you. So Chase Gallagher is going to lead us through that.
All right. And if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first question that we have is, hi, I'm a teenage girl, and I'm wondering, if Kamala Harris wins, how do you think having a woman president will shift the social climate? How might it shift how men treat women?
First of all, I love that you're a teenager who's on this Zoom. I wish I was that wise to know that I should be thinking about politics and the things that impact me in the way that you are. So that is fantastic. Look, I think that we don't know what it's going to look like yet, but if I had to imagine, right, the reason why I would argue, and I do in this book, that you want government to look reflective is because that's the way that policy starts better representing people. We are a diverse and and wide-ranging group here politically, identity-wise, geographically. And so having leaders that reflect that should be beneficial in the outcomes of what government can give us. The example that I think about the most is this idea of how the care economy, things like childcare, the ways that women are able to get back to work. I mean, the pandemic forced us to grapple with a lot of these ideas. But from a policy perspective, the baton was really picked up by women who were serving in Congress and in the administration, who could say, yeah, this is the way that we should be legislating around ideas like paid family leave. They didn't quite get it done in the last Congress, but it was close, and it's very much still central to the conversation. And so having a woman at the top of the entire US government structure should continue to prioritize those issues. And even when you look at the way that Kamala Harris has been one of the key voices in making sure that the Black maternal health crisis has gotten the attention it deserves, and the policy minds centered around it is so critically important. I mean, that's what you get from reflective governance. And so I think that's one of the ways that it could change from a policy perspective. And look, I think that the president is an example setter. It's a tone setter for the country. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect system, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't take time. We are an extremely divided country with a lot of really fiery opinions right now. But I think my hope, and we've seen this conversation playing out in the media in recent weeks too, I think rightfully so, is that we can just take the temperature down, recognize once again that it's okay to disagree with each other and not outright hate each other or despise each other. And I don't know that electing a woman will do that. It's not a magic wand, but I do think it's something for us to strive for as a country after November.
Awesome. Thank you, Ali. Another question, kind of cobbling together a few here, but curious about maybe in the wake of the Dobbs decision and just sort of how like the gender gap is playing out in politics, and if you might have any insights there as to how that's playing out in polling and things like that right now.
I have tons. These are my favorite topics. I'm going to take them separately and then kind of try to weave them together. We'll see if I can do it. It's late here on the East Coast. On the Dobbs decision, I think that this is so central to both Kamala Harris as a candidate, and then also I think the biggest issue that we have no idea how it will play out. It is, to me, the X factor of 2024. Abortion and reproductive healthcare freedom is untested. And the minimal plot points that we have electorally since the Dobbs decision occurred have shown how energizing this issue is for pro-choice advocates and for states that might be red on a map, but this is not an issue that aligns that way. And it necessarily shouldn't be surprising when you look at the fact that the majority of Americans say that abortion should be safe and legal in their opinions. But nevertheless, we're going to watch this theory play out come November. I think it is one of the key energizing issues when you look at polling, when you ask voters what they care about. I'm specifically looking at the ways it might manifest with older women and with suburban women. That polling is still kind of coming together. But again, the most important poll is on election day. But the other piece of it, too, is the ways that Kamala Harris was always the administration's best messenger on reproductive freedom. And she really took a driver's seat role in messaging that around the country. Biden always had a certain uncomfortability, even just saying the word abortion. It's something that I would hear about privately from abortion advocates on a regular basis. And it's also the answer during that June debate where I had the most incoming in my phone because Democrats were concerned that their message on abortion, which is among the starkest contrasts, Trump saying he's proud to have overturned Roe versus Wade, Biden saying that he wanted to protect it, Democrats carrying that message, that was the muddiest moment of all during the debate. I actually think that's the one that gave us the "we killed Medicare" snafu from Biden. And it made Democrats nervous that contrast wasn't being made clearly, starkly, consistently. And then you compare it to the most recent debate that we saw between Harris and Trump, and Harris was able to absolutely hammer on that issue. And I've met Republican women who are deeply uncomfortable with where their party is nationally on this question of limiting women's options and choices around this on a state-by-state basis. I am deeply fascinated as a political follower to see the way that that actually shakes out when voters go to vote.
All right. Next question. And again, just a reminder for folks to submit through the Q&A function in Zoom there. I know there was some news maybe today on the vice president's support for filibuster reform, but we got a question also on whether you think she might, if elected, might work on making the Supreme Court accountable or some of the other court reforms, if you have any insights to share there.
Oh, I love that we're talking filibuster and court reform. I have all the nerds with me on this. What is it, Tuesday night? This is great. Look, on court reform, certainly it's something that you're going to need leadership from the White House on. And I think the would-be Harris administration would probably lead more forcefully on that than a would-be Trump administration. That being said, that does have to come from Congress, right? So when you think about down ballot races, and I think about them all the time as a congressional correspondent, it's really going to matter who has control of the House, and it's really going to matter who has control of the Senate. Right now, the conventional wisdom would tell you it's a very tough map for Democrats in the Senate, and it is a map that has just a handful of races that could decide it in the House. But certainly court reform is something that we would be watching for, I think, more closely if the Democrats remain in control of the Senate. If not, I don't necessarily see that as being a priority. And in the instance where maybe it's, a Harris administration and a Republican Senate, I mean, you are once again in a situation like we've been seeing recently play out, where you're in a point of divided government, and sometimes it's just really hard to get things done. I believe bipartisanship still exists, but I do think court reform, would probably fall to the bottom of the list pretty quickly if Republicans control the Senate.
All right, thank you. Next question. I remember Geraldine Ferraro stating she was surprised it took so long for another woman to be on a major party ticket. In your opinion, why has it taken so long for women to get there?
I do think it's the sample size. And I have to say, we didn't give Geraldine Ferraro her due when we were having our conversation earlier, because of course, 1984, she becomes the first woman to be a major party vice presidential nominee. And watching old footage of her is probably one of my favorite parts about having done research for this book. I mean, she was amazing. She was sassy. She would just give it right back to all of these male reporters who would ask some sometimes pretty borderline inappropriate questions. And so those chapters in the book are truly some of my favorites too. I mean, I think about chapters in this book and it's like having to pick a favorite child or something. But she was fantastic. I do think that the short answer though goes back to what we were talking about, which is the idea that we're talking about such a small sample size of frequency of elections, but then also the idea that the pipeline just hasn't been as full as it is right now for a really long time. And I do think that that's because both parties were slow to invest in bringing more women and more people of color into the fold, of trying to, a group called Emily's List exists because the acronym is early money is like yeast. This idea that you need benefit of the doubt to get people to invest in an early phase of a campaign, especially if maybe you've never run before, especially if maybe you're not already in the halls of political power. You need people who will give you the benefit of the doubt, and benefit of the doubt just more easily flows to men who are white. And that's why organizations like Emily's List exist. It took longer than on the Republican side for those similar kinds of groups to grow, to have the money to sustain themselves, and then to further be able to fund candidates. But now, thankfully, on both sides, everyone seems to have realized that when women run, they win. And it's also important to point out, especially for Republicans, it was such a proof point in 2020 to see that in so many of the races that they flipped from blue to red, that they were flipped by really strong female candidates. And I think that made the light finally go off for those in the halls of power in Washington. Oh yeah, when we invest in these candidates who are just good candidates that happen to be women, they'll win.
All right. Next question. Um, this is sort of open-ended, and I think I probably know the answer, but how do you feel about misinformation in the media?
Bad. I mean, I feel bad because we are in such a fast moving, consistently updating environment. And unfortunately, I look at platforms like X, which, it was Twitter and was hard to sift through Twitter when it was Twitter, but at least there were guardrails there that made it that accurate information was clear for people. That's not to say there wasn't trash on that platform. Certainly, I saw it in my replies and my mentions all the time. But the idea of being verified meant that you were a verified and legitimate news source, or you were seen by Twitter as someone who should be pushing accurate information. The verification process on X, I found it deeply concerning because, especially in a moment coming out of a pandemic where you went online to try to find whatever was new, you wanted to know that you were reading someone who was verified and who you could trust. So are you verified as the city of New York on Twitter, or are you some kind of similar account that could buy a blue check mark and suddenly people would be even more confused? I mean, disinformation can be as casual as that, let alone the bad actors who are on these platforms. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to stay vigilant. That vigilance takes time, it takes energy that maybe some of us don't have, but just look at who you're reading, look at who you're watching. I do encourage people to look across the spectrum of news. If you're watching something that has a liberal bent, look at something that has maybe the opposite view. I think just being aware and informed across the board is just critically important. But certainly the disinformation and misinformation piece of this gets more concerning by the day, especially when you consider things like deep fakes and AI. It can be really hard to sift through.
All right, that's the last question for us this evening, and one that certainly touches close to the heart of a librarian.
Absolutely.
It's something we think about all the time. And I want to thank you, Ali, for being here. This was an amazing conversation. Everyone, please check out Electable. Thank you all for joining us this evening here at the King County Library System. We're excited to connect you to resources to enrich your life and our communities. Have a good night, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.